The grand hall was still vibrating with the echo of applause, the kind of applause that sounds polite but hollow, a performance of diplomacy rather than its substance. Cameras flashed, delegates shook hands stiffly, and aides shuffled their papers as if the fate of nations could be filed away in neat folders. The summit had ended. But in the corner of the hall, away from the applause and the cameras, Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin slipped quietly through a side door. No staff, no translators, no notes, just two men, vanishing into silence. For a moment, no one knew how to react. The press gallery froze. Aides exchanged nervous glances. One journalist whispered under their breath, "What are they doing? What could they possibly need to say without witnesses?" And like the first ripple across a still pond, that question spread through the rows of journalists, through the clusters of diplomats, through the restless crowd outside the summit doors. Inside that private room, the air seemed to thicken with secrecy. This was not the scripted performance of world leaders reciting talking points. This was raw, unfiltered, and dangerous. Rumors began to take shape before the conversation even ended. Aides imagined nuclear codes whispered like poker chips, oil deals sketched on the back of envelopes, or promises made at the expense of smaller nations struggling for survival. Every second that passed without them re-emerging felt like another thread of the global order being quietly rewoven behind closed doors. And still, the cameras waited. The world held its breath. Because everyone in that hall understood one thing. What happened in that room could alter the fate of nations. This wasn't about one war or one country. It was about the balance of power itself. Two men, each carrying their own brand of arrogance and calculation, had decided to shut the world out. And in doing so, they had ignited a fire of speculation that could not be contained. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Then, finally, the door cracked open. The two men stepped out, their faces unreadable, their eyes refusing to betray what had passed between them. And yet, as they walked back into the hall, every person present felt it deep in their bones. Something had shifted. The world outside that summit room was already exhausted. The war in Ukraine had dragged into another relentless season, its battles marked not by sweeping victories, but by mud-soaked stalemates. Soldiers huddled in freezing trenches, writing letters home with hands too numb to hold a pen. Mothers in Kiev clutched their children tighter each night as sirens split the air. Cities once proud with culture and commerce were now scarred with craters and rubble. The fatigue was not just military, it was human. Meanwhile, in capitals across the globe, patience was thinning. Western nations had poured billions into defense packages, sanctions, and aid, but unity was cracking. NATO, once roaring with certainty, had begun to fracture under the weight of its own promises. In Washington, lawmakers debated whether endless support was worth the strain on an already divided America. In Berlin and Paris, whispers of doubt grew louder. How long could Europe shoulder this burden? How long before sacrifice turned to resentment? And yet, in the gilded halls of the summit, there was no mud, no sirens, no hunger. Gadito Chando hung overhead. Velvet curtains sealed the sound of protests outside. Leaders adjusted their ties, traded rehearsed lines, and sipped imported coffee while soldiers thousands of miles away fought for inches of soil. The contrast was blinding. On one side of the world, young men and women clung to life in the trenches. On the other, powerful men debated their future like gamblers around a polished table. This wasn't just diplomacy, it was destiny. That is why the sudden disappearance of Trump and Putin into that side room mattered so much. It wasn't merely two politicians exchanging words. It was the convergence of fatigue, frustration, and fragile alliances. It was the possibility that, in a single conversation, strategies carefully built by dozens of nations could be unraveled. In that moment, the question burned hotter than ever. Were they plotting peace or planning betrayal? Were they drafting an end to the bloodshed or carving a deal that would redraw borders without a single Ukrainian at the table? For those who had invested their hopes, their treasure, and their blood into resisting Russia's invasion, the stakes could not have been higher. Every whisper from behind that closed door carried the weight of a generation's struggle. And outside, the journalists knew it. Their pens trembled not because they feared silence, but because they feared what would happen once silence broke. History has taught us this truth. Great turning points rarely announce themselves with fanfare. They creep quietly, disguised as private conversations, secret notes, or a handshake away from the cameras. That night was no different. The war was bleeding into stalemate. The world was desperate for resolution, and two men had chosen to lock themselves away from the world. But whispers alone cannot contain the pressure of destiny. What the world did not yet know was that the words exchanged in that hidden room were not just careless dialogue, not just bravado between rivals. They were sparks, tiny incendiary sparks, that threatened to ignite something far larger. And when those sparks caught flame, they would not only consume the walls of that summit hall. They would sweep across nations, across borders, and across the fragile sense of order that held the world together. Because what happened that night would ignite more than whispers. It would trigger a global reckoning. Vladimir Putin has always walked into a room like a man who believes he already owns it. His presence carries a chilling weight, a silence that seems to bend others into submission before a single word leaves his lips. To the outside world, he projects the image of a man carved from stone, unyielding, decisive, a master of strategy. But beneath that mask of strength lies something darker, paranoia, suspicion, and a hunger for control that has consumed him for decades. From the earliest days of his rise, Putin built power not with trust but with fear. In Moscow, he learned to keep allies close but never close enough to challenge him. His empire of loyalty was constructed on favors traded in shadows, on promises sealed not by law but by threat. To shake his hand was to feel the cold steel of an unspoken contract. Obey or be cast aside. And the world noticed. At summit after summit, Putin perfected his theater of intimidation. He would arrive late, forcing leaders to wait as if their time meant nothing. He would sit at absurdly long tables, turning conversation into a performance of distance. He once kept Angela Merkel waiting for hours, knowing her fear of dogs, then letting his Labrador wander the room while he smirked. These were not accidents. They were deliberate tests, little humiliations designed to remind his counterparts that he could bend even the most powerful to his will. Yet behind the walls of the Kremlin, where no cameras dared to intrude, Putin's grip on power revealed its fragility. Obsessed with loyalty, he cycled ministers in and out like pieces on a chessboard, never allowing anyone to grow too comfortable. His inner circle was less a team than a set of hostages bound by wealth and fear. He surrounded himself with sycophants who repeated what he wanted to hear, all while his own suspicion deepened. The man who looked invincible on the world stage was, in truth, haunted by the shadows of betrayal. And this duality defined him. To the outside world, he was a master of strength. To those who looked closer, he was a prisoner of his own paranoia. That contradiction made him dangerous, because a man who trusts no one will do anything to ensure he cannot be undone. History is littered with moments where Putin's shadow fell across the stage of diplomacy. In 2007, he stared down world leaders at the Munich Security Conference and declared the West arrogant and overreaching, setting the tone for a new age of confrontation. In 2014, when he annexed Crimea, he justified it as protecting Russian identity, but the truth was more brutal. He had discovered how easily fear could redraw maps. Each triumph only emboldened him, feeding the belief that no one, no president, no alliance, no nation, could stand in his way. But his greatest weapon was not just tanks or missiles. It was his ability to bend narratives, to exploit weakness, to make opponents doubt themselves. In past meetings, leaders had faltered under his glare, second-guessed their positions, or softened their tone. He thrived on hesitation. He fed off uncertainty. He treated diplomacy not as negotiation, but as domination. And yet, as the Ukraine war dragged on, cracks began to form. His promise of quick victory had dissolved into endless bloodshed. Sanctions had bled the Russian economy. The oligarchs grumbled in silence. And even ordinary Russians, once muted by fear, began to whisper doubts. Still, Putin pressed forward, unwilling to admit failure, unwilling to concede weakness. He carried the shadow of an empire on his shoulders, and he would sooner let it collapse than let it be seen as vulnerable. That was the man who slipped into the private room with Donald Trump. Cold, calculating, and desperate to maintain his image of invincibility. He believed, as he always had, that intimidation could carry the day, that his reputation as the unbreakable strongman would crush any resistance. For years it had worked. Leaders had caved, alliances had softened, nations had fallen silent under the pressure of his presence. But this night was different. This time, the fatigue of war and the fracture of alliances had created a stage where even the master manipulator could miscalculate. For the first time, his certainty was about to be tested. Donald Trump has never been a man easily confined to labels. To some, he is the embodiment of arrogance. To others, the voice that shatters the polished veneer of politics. But one truth has always defined him. He thrives when underestimated. Trump has built his identity on defiance, against the media, against the establishment, against anyone who dared to suggest he could not bend history to his will. And on this night, as he stepped into that side room with Vladimir Putin, that defiance would become his armor. Trump's rise was not born in the smoke-filled backrooms of Washington, but in the glass towers of Manhattan. He cut deals not by compromise but by force of personality. He understood spectacle and he weaponized it. His critics called him chaotic, reckless, a man addicted to the sound of his own voice. But to his supporters, especially those who felt ignored or silenced, he was something else entirely. Raw, unfiltered, unafraid to say what others would not. That duality, brashness and instinct, became both his weakness and his strength. He often stumbled where polish was required, yet he flourished where boldness was demanded. While other leaders rehearsed their lines, Trump improvised, and in those unscripted moments he believed he revealed something truer than any carefully crafted speech, his refusal to be handled, his refusal to play by rules he did not write. At the heart of his political identity lay the mantra of America First. For his critics, it was a slogan of isolation. For his base, it was a promise of protection, dignity, and pride. Trump saw himself not as a servant of institutions, but as the sole defender of a nation he believed was being hollowed out by globalist games. In his mind, he alone had the toughness to face figures like Putin without blinking, to shield his people from being reduced to pawns in someone else's chessboard. But this belief did not come without scars. From the moment he entered politics, Trump waged war on two fronts, against his rivals and against the system itself. Impeachments, investigations, endless headlines seeking to bury him. He faced them all with the same instinctive counterpunch. To his followers, every attack confirmed their belief that he was the outsider chosen to shake the halls of power. To his enemies, his survival felt like proof that chaos had become permanent. And yet, beneath the bravado, there was calculation. Trump knew the cameras always lingered longer on him. He knew his unpredictability was both a weapon and a shield. And in Putin, he recognized not just a rival but a mirror, a man who thrived on intimidation, on bending others to his will. The difference was that while Putin cloaked himself in icy control, Trump wielded volatility like a sword. The silence inside the side chamber was suffocating at first, thick with unspoken tension. A polished oak table stretched between them, its glossy surface reflecting the weight of two men who had long learned to weaponize presence. On one side, Vladimir Putin leaned back with that familiar icy composure, lips curling into a half-smile that was more threat than charm. On the other, Donald Trump leaned forward, elbows planted, eyes flashing with the restless energy of a man who refused to be dwarfed. It began with pleasantries, brittle and meaningless. A few carefully chosen words about stability, about respect between nations. But the air was charged, and it didn't take long for sparks to fly. "You've lost the world's patience," Trump said suddenly, cutting through the diplomatic veneer like a knife. His tone was casual, almost mocking, but every syllable carried steel. Putin's smile widened, though his eyes remained narrow and cold. And yet, the world still fears me. Fear is patience in disguise. Trump scoffed, shaking his head. No. Fear is weakness pretending to be power, and weakness always shows itself in the end. For the first time, the room crackled. These were not two men exchanging policy points. These were titans circling, testing, daring the other to blink. Putin, master of silence, let the pause stretch uncomfortably, forcing Trump to fill the air. But Trump thrived in chaos. He interrupted, he jabbed, he threw lines designed to provoke. You think holding on to Ukraine proves strength? It proves desperation. You're clinging to a war you can't win. Putin's reply was cold, almost whispered. And you think America can afford to fight forever? Your allies crumble. Your people grow tired. Time is my ally, not yours. Their voices grew sharper, bouncing off the wood-paneled walls like blades colliding. Trump's interruptions cut into Putin's deliberate calm. Putin's smirks cut back with chilling precision. Neither man looked away. Neither man shifted in his seat. It was a duel of wills as much as words. Outside the room, aides strained to hear, catching fragments through the heavy door. Phrases like strength, victory, betrayal leaked out in shards, feeding the frenzy of speculation in the hall. Journalists scribbled notes furiously, guessing at outcomes they could not yet see. Inside, the atmosphere thickened. Trump's voice grew more forceful, pushing past the veneer of diplomacy into the raw territory of ego and pride. Putin, unflinching, absorbed each jab with an almost sinister calm, waiting for his moment to strike back. Because history does not belong to the few who meet in private. It belongs to the many who refuse to be silent. And as the echoes of that summit reverberated across continents, the choice stood stark and undeniable: the people or the puppeteers. Trump and Putin spoke after the Ukraine summit, and the echoes are still being felt. The world leaned in, desperate to decode the silence of that side room. And yet, the truest story was never about their whispered words. It was about the power those whispers could never contain. Because secrecy breeds fear, but truth breeds freedom. Manipulation builds empires of sand, but courage carves monuments that endure. What happened that night will be argued over for years. Analysts will speculate, commentators will dissect, partisans will spin. But in the end, one reality remains unshakable. The destiny of nations cannot and must not be decided by the shadows of two men alone. It belongs to the people, to us. To the immigrant worker who builds with pride, to the soldier who fights for dignity, to the young activist who refuses to be silenced. That is where history lives, and that is where history will turn. So, as we close this chapter, remember, the lesson is not theirs, it is ours. Question power. Demand transparency. Stand for justice. Because silence only serves those who rule in darkness, and our voices are the light. If you believe in truth over secrecy, if you believe in courage over manipulation, then share the story. Subscribe, join, and raise your voice. Because the fight for dignity, for democracy, for freedom, it doesn't end at closed doors. It begins with us. And together, we can ensure that when history is written, it is written not by the whispers of rulers, but by the roar of people who refuse to be ignored.